Okay, so a little bit of a better solution here for the lighting. Um, I hope that I haven't kind of lost everybody. I know that quite a few of you were tuned in, and then I had to run off and get this kind of different light to use. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. Sorry for the delay. I just had a little bit of a technical problem with some of the lighting in my studio here, or in my kind of traveling studio. I'm in Norway at the moment, as many of you know, and so I don't have the advantages of my beautiful, perfect studio lighting at home. So I'm kind of working a little bit with what I've got. But I have an absolute ton of kind of comments and questions that I've gotten over the month. And I'm going to try my best to kind of get to all of them. And if you have some also, just put them into the comments and I'll see if I can get to them also just while I'm working. So let's see. Reese Osborne was asking, I'm working on bark plates, but I've heard one direction of using a notional space box that defines the top, bottom, and sides as a tool to measure lines and angles better, placing the image in a box. Thoughts? This is this a method that's taught at the FAA? And essentially, this notional space box, which is, I think, it's something very familiar that, of course, I've heard talked about a lot. Though the language used at FAA is kind of an envelope shape. So like if I was drawing an envelope shape around this, I would kind of start at the sides, trying to indicate using kind of large straight lines what the kind of overall shape of the subject is. Now, this idea of using an envelope shape can be very useful when you're, say, drawing something like a nude figure. When you're drawing something like, say, a portrait like this one, where really so much of the information is inside the contour, you could see how like this idea of a notional space box or whatever could be in some ways limiting. Now, well, just because in some ways something is limiting doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. It's only that the value of the envelope shape or notional space box really, I think, is much more related to when you're kind of copying barks or working on kind of inanimate subjects. I think it can be relatively interesting. But the other thing is that I think that the slightly misunderstood aspect of the envelope shape is actually how short a time it actually lives in your drawing. The envelope shape is something that exists maybe in the first, 10, 15 minutes of your drawing. And after that, you have elaborated in such a way that you have kind of passed up a little bit, the idea of the notional space box or of the envelope shape. So yeah, can be useful, but also kind of know where its utility is. Its utility is kind of primarily in the kind of just the very earliest kind of moments of the drawing. Another question from the medical artist. He asks, what are some drawing exercises to improve understanding of light and shadows? I found the conceptual sphere tutorial very useful and would like to learn more so I can prepare myself better for portrait drawing. The understanding of shadow and light is dependent upon a couple of factors, or at least having a project that allows you to better understand those things is dependent upon a few factors. One of which is actually the lighting that you use to light your subject. A shadow shape and light shape situation is best understood when you have a kind of primary dominant light source, right? So we all know, like in different settings, like if we're like in our living room, for instance, we probably have a lamp over here in the corner and we have some overhead lighting over here, and we're holding our iPhone and it's lighting in our face from another direction. So we have, 3 separate light sources lighting the head from different directions. Now, while this does not like interrupt completely the idea of shadow and light as a natural kind of reality, what it does is obfuscates or makes more difficult to observe the primary like relationship in between them. So what you want is that primary dominant light source. You want limited to no kind of ambient light sources kind of lighting from other sides. And this will help you to kind of see a really clear kind of delineation of shadow and light, which should help you to kind of start to understand a little bit better the nature of kind of shadow and light. That being said, you also have to be kind of equipped with a couple of ideas. So the principal idea that certainly that I work with, right, is that shadow is atmosphere and light is form. Now, this is something that is not unique to me. It's a Florence Academy idea, or really, if you go kind of further back from that, probably like a French Academy idea. And I'm not really certain exactly where that verbiage comes from, like who was the first one to say shadow is atmosphere and light is form. But it's just a ubiquitous statement that I've heard like over and over at the Florence Academy, and in turn I've said over and over at the Florence Academy. So it's one of those things that kind of hangs around. But what it means essentially is that in order to kind of achieve the full effect of contrast that you have in nature, due to the kind of restraints of your material and the two-dimensional surface that you're working on, what you face eventually is the need to unify or compress a different side of the value scale. So if we go from the darkest values to the lightest values, we take the darkest values, push them together like this so that there's more room on the value scale for the lightest values. And that essentially creates a shadow that's a lot flatter, a lot more atmospheric. Now, this phenomenon is very much observable. So if you look at, say, a passage like this on a model, with your eyes wide open, you'll be able to search for the difference in between the dark of the nostril and the darkness of the down plane of the nose. That being said, if you zoom your eyes out and look at the whole head, and you squint down a little bit, what you'll notice is that these values tend to group together, tend to bond together. And we see more clearly how the light shape kind of emerges from that. So the medical artist, that is, in a way, the best way to kind of understand shadow and light is to work on subjects which have a strong primary light source. Usually cast drawing is really good for this because it has no kind of local value changes in the surface, and then make sure that it's lit with that primary light source, which will enable you to kind of study, you know, that duality, that relationship between light and shadow. Let's see. Reese Osborne also asked in the comments, my question is about the why and history of sharpening pencils and charcoal. And I think what Reese is referring to is this way that I will sharpen my pencils to have like a very large amount of the graphite exposed or the charcoal exposed. And this is kind of a habit that I got into at the Florence Academy. I think I've discussed it a little bit eventually in some of my tutorials, but I'll just reiterate here. The idea behind doing this, right, is that you have a sharper pencil longer, right, for a longer duration. So as I draw and draw and draw, inevitably the pencil gets a bit dull. If we have a long kind of conical tip, the idea is that will stay sharper for a longer period of time. Whether or not empirically that's necessarily true, I think that's the primary idea that's put forward by people, at least when I was starting to kind of do this. And the other idea that kind of goes along with that is maybe a little bit, you know, I don't know if it's true, whether it's not true, but what people will say is that it forces you to have like a lighter hand, as you can't kind of choke up on the pencil and kind of draw like this. That being said, I've seen people with pencils this long choke up on them and draw like that and not have a light hand. So whether or not one equals the other, like if you sharpen a pencil like this, therefore you will not choke up on your pencil and have a heavy hand. I don't think that's necessarily true on its own, but maybe it's a disincentive to kind of choking up on your pencil. It helps you to kind of hold it back here and kind of draw in the way that you should be drawing. So I need to just go back into my Patreon account and go back to some questions that I've got. So let's see here. Sheila Horvitz asks, let's see, a technical question about mixing. The warm, cool navigation of flesh tones. We have areas where there is more black or more yellow-brown or more vermilion than you had in your pre-mixtures, yet you're adding any of these hues, especially black, to a pre-mixture, then it's going to darken it. I'll kind of synopsize the question here because it's a little bit of a long question. And also to the medical artist, I see your question in the comments, have you ever used an F or an EB pencil? I have used an F. I think it's supposed to be like an F is in between the H range and the B range. So I think you'd have like, you'd go 3H, 2H, H, and then F, and then HB. So I think it's somewhere in between like an H and an HB, or in between HB and B. Some people are really fond of them. I'm not sure. I didn't notice like a different feeling about it, but if you like them, I think that's cool too. And I have never used an EB pencil. I'd be curious to know what that is. So this question about pre-mixtures in oil painting, right? So if you watch my oil painting videos, you'll see that I'll have like several kind of mixtures in a kind of value string that go kind of from darker into lighter. And this is to kind of get a flesh tone range established, after which I can kind of mix in between them or mix kind of pure pigments into them. That being said, if I take a higher key value and I want to make it more cool, I have to add like a blue or a black to it. Now the local value of blue or black is actually darker than what this is, so I will be necessarily compromising the value of this pre-mixture by mixing another pigment into it. Now, this is where it becomes interesting to define what kind of palette I have, right? So essentially there are two kinds of palettes that you have, or at least let's say that for the sake of this discussion, I'll describe two different kinds of palettes. You can have an open palette or a closed palette. An open palette is that we'll take our pure pigments, so black, vermilion, yellow-brown, and white, and we'll brush mix in between them only. So I'll just take a bit of black, a bit of vermilion, and then I have purple brown and a bit of white, and I lighten it up. But I'm always doing that kind of on the fly with my brush. This is the essence of like an open palette. A closed palette then is that I have only pre-mixtures, right? Like you'll see maybe artists that are using a Munsell color system, right? That they'll have all these pre-mixtures and those will go directly from their palette onto the painting. What I do is a little bit of a hybrid of that. I like to have pre-mixtures because obviously like pure vermilion doesn't go straight onto the flesh very often. So you need to go through this process of kind of neutralization, which, is a very sensitive process and can take some challenges to kind of get to the right color and value. So what I do is kind of shortcut that by making pre-mixtures. But then I'll happily kind of take a bit of yellow or a bit of vermilion and add it to a pre-mixture to warm it up, or a bit of black to cool it off. If I add black to a pre-mixture and I'm intent upon keeping the same value, then of course I need to add white to it as well. But that goes into the open-closed palette hybrid. So super technical answer to that question. And let's see. Yeah, if there are any other questions that kind of come along here, please just put them into the comments, and I'll get to them as soon as I see them. Otherwise, there's plenty of stuff that I want to kind of chat on about. So I released also, yesterday, the third video in the Quick Sketch series, and I just wanted to mention, like, talking about that one, that video in particular, but also that whole kind of project, maybe some of the things that I thought were really interesting about working that way, and things that I hope, of course, that all of you are kind of like assimilating and kind of working with. But what I thought was really cool with that was the way that kind of like each project kind of led into the other. Um, you know, understanding the head and how to kind of represent a head like this on a flat surface, it really requires so much of your imagination and your memory to kind of understand how this is round. It's not maybe the most natural thing or not the first thing that we do to kind of take a 2D surface and make it round. It really requires so much learning. And this is where the question that I think is most often asked about a drawing that's taking place or that has already been done actually becomes maybe an interesting one. I'm sure that you've either asked yourself or been curious, is this from life or is this from a photo? And that seems to be usually where that kind of conversation ends. So you'll say, well, it's from life, so that's good, or it's from photos, so that's bad. That is the uninformed, like straw man kind of dichotomy that is created. But I want to unpack a little bit of what that means and why people actually kind of think that, because it's usually kind of a trickle down thing where you've heard someone else say it, or a student has heard someone else say it, and so they begin to say it themselves. What drawing from photographs alone makes very difficult is for you to understand that this is one perspective view of a three-dimensional head. And that if you move from here over to here, what is now inside the form will become a profile, a contour. And there's a depth to this understanding that really, really helps you figure out how the planes of value on a flat surface work. So let's look at like the forehead versus the glabella versus the top plane of the nose versus the bottom plane of the nose versus the front plane of the muzzle form, right? Let me do a little diagram on the side here. So this forehead, right, essentially is shaped like this, right? It has a kind of turning plane in the middle of it. And if I have light coming from above, what do I immediately see about that light? This plane faces the light more immediately than this one. Or even let's say that this little Apelles line, this meeting of two planes in the middle, maybe that's really where the highlight sits because of where the light is oriented. Now, let's look at these two planes in relationship to the subsequent plane, right? The plane of the glabella. Now this plane is turning away from the light. So the light that's coming here and like hitting these planes, right? It can't also hit this plane in the same way. So what that means is that we start to understand there's the necessity of a value change there, right? So if this is lit quite directly from above, then I should understand explicitly that the glabella turns down from there. Taking that forward another step, the top plane of the nose, right? It must receive a very similar light to the light of the forehead, since it's also kind of facing a very similar direction. And as we get to the kind of bottom plane of the nose, where it goes from the tip out here to kind of meet the front plane of the muzzle form, again, this one, there's no way the light's getting to that. And what do we find here? We find dark halftone, we find shadow, we find a down plane, okay? So while this is kind of immediately evident, just like when you look at a face, yeah, it looks dark, so I put a bunch of dark value there. The way that I think it becomes quite specific is that we understand how those individual planes are turning away from the light source and how to kind of understand how to organize the values in between them so that we have a coherent sense of form from top to bottom, right? I think what a lot of us do, or like what a lot of students will do kind of looking at values, is they'll look here and here and here at all the different values, and they will see so much variety, but they will not see the similarity in between the top plane of the forehead and the top plane of the nose and how the light must be hitting those equally. The same thing about the kind of down-facing planes as well, that those should be also kind of a part of a group. So the thing to kind of understand about drawing, again, from a flat image, from a photograph, is that it does not necessarily reveal in reality, right, in the most observable way, this idea of the direction of planes. Whereas if I, instead of looking at the model from here, if I walked around her and looked at her from here, I would have an entirely different perspective as to why these kind of values existed on the face. Whereas in a photo, that's not necessarily revealed. So if you have, of course, like studied from life quite a bit, you can understand that this still exists in like a two-dimensional formation. And you can kind of read the signals from a two-dimensional source image, right? And still intuit and understand visually why those values are turning and why those planes are turning. And if you have not necessarily, what you wind up being left with is just a two-dimensional pattern of values that does not necessarily reveal a correlation in between all the values on all the planes. So hopefully that's not like too abstract an idea to express in a live stream, but just to say like that's the primary difference. That's what is on the back end of the conversation about photos versus life. Is it's not just about one good, one bad. It's about what they tend to reveal. And so usually like if you're talking to an academic, they're going to say like, well, life is the only way to learn. And you know what? They're also not wrong. Like drawing from life is massively helpful. It reveals so much. But also like there's another side of it that is, if you kind of grasp these ideas, it's not like you can't learn while not working from life. Of course you can. In fact, like there are plenty of artists out there who I either know personally or I know their work that I know that they also have learned by working from two-dimensional sources. So let's just put to bed the idea that one is uniformly good and the other uniformly bad. So let's get to maybe another question. Let's see, what have we got? I just have to go to my Instagram here just to see what the other questions are. 1 second, everybody. So let's see. This is a name that I can't necessarily pronounce, but Fire from Ja asks, how does different lighting affect how your drawings look? Does the different lighting from different angles affect the perception of the drawing? And also, I've just got a few questions on here from people watching right now. Sam Wilbraham asks, why is it that a photo seems to flatten the form? And by following the modeling of the form, can we tend to over-exaggerate the form? Well, you know, Sam, you probably logged into the live stream just a moment after I kind of explained this whole idea of the kind of relationship between 3D and 2D form. I think that just in general, it depends upon the practitioner. I think if you have a very solid idea of the three-dimensional kind of qualities and properties of the head, then I think you'll be able to translate that two-dimensional source image into a good three-dimensionally appearing drawing. And Sheila Horvitz says here, the naturalists used photos, but they were academically trained, so they had the knowledge from life. Yeah, this is exactly, I think, aligned with my feeling. There's even a great book. Wow, if you guys have the chance to get this book, it's a book on Danyan Bouveret. And I will not expect you to be able to kind of spell that just from my pronunciation, which is probably terrible. But let me see if I write it out here. Wow, that's some serious handwriting problem. Let me do that one over. I need like a do-over on that. So let's see here. Danyan. All right. D-A-G-N-A-N. Bouveret, B-O-U-V-E-R-E-T. So Danyan Bouveret was a really fantastic like French academic painter. Well, I don't know, maybe I don't want to call him necessarily French academic. He was academically trained, and I'm not sure that he ever later went on to teach at the academy, so I don't want to put him into that box. But suffice to say, an incredible painter, and this book on him, I'm sure that somebody will Google it while I'm talking here, and I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I think it was a book that was put out when he had an exhibition, or his work was exhibited at the Dahesh Museum in New York. And it's just a really amazing catalog of a fantastic artist's work. And you can see also in it at the end, like some of the major projects he was doing, you can see kind of the source imagery that he used to kind of help him execute those. The medical artist here asks, thanks, Stephen. I thought it was only possible to understand by live drawing only. Yeah, well, you know, this is a common misconception. And this is something actually I was filming a little bit on this, which will later be a tutorial video that I'm going to put out soon. And I was talking about exactly this thing today. You know, when teachers give you an absolute that they say it's only possible to learn this way, I think that while probably there are some very good intentions there, I think they're oversimplifying the state of affairs in order to more conveniently, convey an idea, right? So if the idea is drawing from life is good, right? It's helpful. Then maybe a student will ask, well, maybe what if it isn't helpful? Are there other ways that are helpful too? It becomes very easy for a teacher to say, the only way to do it, the only way to learn is draw and paint from life. And that will effectively convey the idea that drawing and painting from life is very good. But also, again, it's a massive oversimplification of what it is to kind of figure out how to draw and paint. Plenty of people learn without necessarily working primarily from life. I think that, you know, by the way, I would have to say, I think drawing from life is a fantastic way to learn. Not everybody can get to an academy where that is conducive or into a situation where that's the norm. I mean, I worked from life for, you know, at the academy as a student for 4 years, 5 days a week, you know, sometimes 6 hours a day. So yeah, having that background is fantastic, but you know, it's also like a massive accomplishment to get into an arrangement where that can work. Pete Anderson in the comments here says, I find the Asaro head from life helps to reinforce this idea and can be used to apply drawing from photos. Yeah, I think you're referring to this. There's this really great simplified head that's out there. Yeah, it is the Asaro head. Yeah, now that I think of it. That is available online for a very reasonable price. And what it is basically just a head simplified into planes. And so when you have a photograph, for instance, that you're working from, and you're not maybe like trained for 5 years from life, so maybe you don't have as clear an idea of the planes of the head, you can put a light on that, onto that Asaro head from the same direction. And then you do have the opportunity to kind of look at it from all these different perspectives and understand how the form and the planes are interrelated to like each other from a light effect standpoint. So it's such a wonderful resource. I encourage everybody to have one. And by the way, to have like a skull replica in your studio as well, for the exact same reasons. Pete Anderson also says, even though the planes on the Asaro head are quite exaggerated, it's a great tool. Yeah, this is the other side of the Asaro head as well, is that everybody wants a different simplification of the head. The Asaro one is just one person's or one artist's idea of how that simplification should look. And so naturally, there can be, you can be either satisfied or dissatisfied with it. Just based on, you know, everybody's slightly different kind of conception of what's important in that simplification. Nonetheless, the Asaro head, I think, is the one that is most widely available. And Sam Wilbraham is mentioning Against the Modern. I think you're right, that is the Danyan Bouveret, the title of the book. And actually, if everybody's looking at the comments now, Sam Wilbraham has put the full title, Against the Modern, Danyan Bouveret and the Transformation of the Academic Tradition. Such a fantastic artist. And really, in a way, not necessarily aligned with, but when I was studying, two artists that I was really into at the time was Danyan Bouveret and Bastien Lepage. Both of those kind of French naturalists artists were, I think, really amazing. And I think, there's actually a Lepage, Bastien Lepage head that I might do a study of as well, a master copy study, which, by the way, just so everybody knows, I'm going to be putting out the master copy download later in the month. So probably towards the end of September, I'm going to post that and you guys can download it and it's all there. And I'm really actually excited about releasing this for patrons. Again, it's only going to be available for a couple of weeks, so you got to get in and download it so that you don't kind of miss out. But I'm sure even if you miss out, you can email me and I'll give you a link anyway. So to move on, there was a pertinent comment by Pete Anderson here that the head, the Asaro head, is based on the Riley method. And so the Riley method as well, again, I haven't looked, quite honestly, very deeply into the Riley method. I understand roughly the basis of it. And, I think that templates and formulas are really good for kind of studying heads. Though like anything, the Riley method is like one side of the story. I would try not to too deeply buy into it because, again, like any formula risks to become in some ways a little bit generic. That's not a reason not to pursue it and understand it, but it's a reason to not pursue it alone. In fact, it kind of reminds me of something in a way that I was even very deeply aware of, like as a student. So like you come to the Florence Academy and you have sometimes like 7 different teachers that are kind of coming around to you each week, talking to you about your work, and necessarily each one of them has like a slightly different way of expressing an idea. Even if, the idea is like bedrock simple, like this is shadow and light, or, the concept of like the interrelationship of values. Even on ideas that kind of basic, everybody has a kind of slightly different way of understanding or expressing them. And so like students can become a little bit confused by, these different expressions and think that they're a contradiction, and, get really frustrated by that. And the truth that they come to eventually, and that all of us teachers at the Florence Academy know, is that we're really talking about the same thing from a slightly different perspective. And actually that's a strength. When you can get, one side of the story, you are necessarily kind of biased towards that side. And that's always what you'll see. If you get a kind of well-rounded, version of the story, I think then you have the opportunity to kind of make your own mind up about what works and what to believe. And I think that is how you become like a very effective artist, is very much by making up your own mind rather than by kind of subordinating your opinion to just what you have heard. So I say go out there and find as many kind of reference points as you can in terms of what is kind of most useful. Let's see. I've got to find some more questions. I know I have a lot of them kind of hanging out. Just have them all in kind of like different places. And a couple of comments here. The medical artist is asking, what are the most important lessons you learned from the Florence Academy of Art? Wow. How long have you got? I started at the Florence Academy as a student in 2004, and I studied there. I graduated technically in 2007, but I kept studying till 2008. And, it's interesting that I think the information that I was learning was more the same, but I changed over time. I think I had like eventually a deeper grasp of things because of the way I was looking at them rather than that new information was revealed to me, if that makes sense. So the most important lessons I learned were not purely technical. So one of the things that I thought when I came to the Florence Academy, right, was that, 4 hours was like a long time to spend on a drawing. And you go into the model room and your first long pose is 75 hours. And you think, how can a person like take that long? And then as time goes on, you think, how can a person finish a drawing in 75 hours? It's impossible. And then eventually you start to think, well, it doesn't really take 75 hours to make a drawing. It takes 75 hours if you don't know necessarily what to do. If you do know what to do, maybe it takes 10 hours. So again, like in that situation or in that instance, you know, I learned a lot, like kind of through the process, and I learned different things at different moments. There were a lot of times, I think, where teachers were trying to tell me something that I wasn't even necessarily ready to understand yet. And that didn't mean that it was like wasted time for me to hear that. It simply meant that that was going to rattle around in my head until the moment that I was really ready to kind of capture what it meant and apply it to a subject. So this is one of the reasons why, like, I try as much as possible in my teaching and when I'm working with my mentorship students here on Patreon, I try to be as practical and actionable as possible, right? All these like philosophical ideas are best expressed when they have some foundation in action, right? Because this is a very much a practical problem we're trying to solve. You can't, unfortunately, draw with a philosophy. You have to attach some technical processes to that philosophy. And so, again, you know, while I was practicing these very rudimentary studies in my first years at the academy, sometimes teachers would tell me things that years later I would then kind of discover the wealth of knowledge inside of. So in terms of like what the most important lessons that I learned at the academy, if I had to choose or align them as most important or not, I would say probably the idea of like kind of patience with my progress, which to be fair, like I'm only so patient. I'm not a saint. But to be a lot more patient than I thought I needed to be about my process. You know, you go into the academy inevitably thinking, and this story is like as old as the academy itself. You know, people go to the academy thinking like, all right, after one trimester, you know, after 3 months of this, I'll probably have, you know, I'll have got my knowledge about realism, and I'm just going to go out and kind of paint or whatever. But you realize, I think, very quickly that it's going to be a game played in terms of years and not months. Reese, let's see. Pete Anderson also comments, absolutely, it's just a guide to understanding. It's a tool for the student to help them to understand and recognize the planes and rhythms in the face and body. It's referring to the Asaro head. And then Reese Osborne comments, while at FAR, while at FAA, probably, Florence Academy of Art, was there anything, i.e. methods, you questioned? And if so, what? Absolutely, completely, yes, everything. You know, if you're a driven person and you're quite analytical and you really want to figure something out, inevitably you're going to question what's told to you. Add to that as well, and this is a really, you know, this is related, I think, to what I was just saying a moment ago. You're going to be receiving advice at the Florence Academy from people like me, people that have been veterans of this for 15 years, that have been practicing this and studying this and working on this. And you're going to hear advice that you're likely not prepared to understand yet. And so when you hear that, you will think, surely not. That's not true. I've experienced this so often as an anatomy teacher, right? That I'll be critiquing students' work in the model room, and I'll be talking to them about the subcutaneous forms and bony points, and I'll explain this all to them, and they'll say, "Oh yes, but you're drawing that because you know the anatomy, not because you see it that on the model." Because for them, for their eyes, right, for their eyes that are not necessarily attuned to these things, they genuinely do not notice it, right? And I have to reply that, of course, no, I see these things because I know that they are there and I can find them. Think about walking through the forest with a botanist, right? If you walk through the forest and you look at the trees, you will see some leaves, some bark, some roots. That will be your level of penetration into that world, right, of observation. a botanist will be in there telling you different genus of like lichen that is like living on the bark, that they'll be able to tell you in a greater depth of detail what you're actually seeing. And it's not because they just know it, that they imagine it to be there. It's because that they know it, that they are able to see it, that they're able to find it. Pete Anderson comments here, there was no right or wrong way and would suggest learning many possible methods and build your own way of approaching the subject. Absolutely, that couldn't be any closer to my own kind of feeling about studying. And it's why that I of course attempt to express as much as possible, like in my tutorials, different kind of points of view. And actually maybe it's an interesting moment to kind of bring up. I know that on one level, it makes it more difficult for you to grab a hold of something and make it your own, right? If I just said to you, always do this, right? A prescription or a prescriptive advice, always draw with a line quality like this. It would be easy to take that away. You would remember it very easily and clearly. But you would also find times when that's not true, when using a line quality like this is not the right thing to do. And I don't like to tell like a half-truth. And so I say that line quality is something that you have to be in control of, and you have to know how to organizing it, or rather how to organize it. And you have to have a strategy for that organization that is holistic. Those things I know to be true about line quality, even if it doesn't point to a line like this and say, use that every time. I think I am actually coming to the end of the live stream. I think Instagram allows for up to an hour of live stream to take place on one stream before it automatically cuts off. But let's see. If there's any more questions here, just put them in the comments and I'll get to it. If not, I'm just looking on my Patreon now for some other comments to see if there's anything to answer. Yeah, Puck Askew actually commented on my Patreon page and asked, said that she was just taking a workshop with Jesus Villarreal, who's a good friend of mine, and said that, she asked, where is a good place to buy plaster casts? And this is a complicated answer, unfortunately, but the best place to buy them, there is a studio in Rome, I think, and it's called Felice Calci, but they're like a glyptotek, a plaster studio in Rome, and to me their casts have the greatest fidelity to like the original subjects. And I'll post a link on Patreon to their webpage so that you can find them and contact them. I understand that shipping sculptures from Rome is not going to be the most cost-effective thing, but unfortunately when you're talking about quality, it's very important. I mean, I've seen in the States so many times plaster casts that are like the silicone has been cast too many times, and so it's floppy, or they have not allowed the plaster to dry enough, so parts of it have wilted, and there's so many problems you can find with plaster casts that I would rarely just like trust anything out of hand that this is going to be a good one. So the best I can say is this studio in Rome, and the let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's another solution that I'd be prepared to just put out there. I'll take a look at it. I know that there's a lot of like sculpture students from the Florence Academy that eventually started selling plaster casts, and so that can be interesting to contact them as well. Diana Armstrong asks, did you experience a difficult period of adjustment after finishing your degree at the Florence Academy, or was it a smooth transition to working on your own away from academia? Great question. In reality, I never actually started working away from academia, because as soon as I graduated, I started teaching. Actually, I was a teacher's assistant when I was in Florence, and then when I graduated, I was hired full-time. So I've never really been away from academia. But that doesn't mean that I haven't actually had problems kind of transitioning into like who I am as an artist. I think that one of the things that was a big problem for me going from like working as an academic student into working as a professional artist was the preconceptions I had about what was necessary for you to make artwork. And it was maybe this idea that meaning comes from the subject matter, not from the artist. And I think that that's incorrect. I think that the meaning comes from what you put into the work, not from what you are observing necessarily. So there's a reason that like an artist like Dermot Kelly, this Irish painter, right, can paint a coffee cup and it seems filled to the brim with meaning and purpose. No pun intended there. And another artist could paint the same coffee cup in the same light, and we would not find it as potent as me and as meaningful. And that's not to do with the coffee cup. It's to do with Dermot Kelly. It's to do with the meaning that he puts into the work, in his observation and his attention and his sensitivity. So that was, I think, for me, one of the biggest misconceptions I had being an artist that I had to kind of overcome. And it led to so many kind of false starts, I think, that that I assumed I had to make something else out of something other than what it was. And that was the key to finding meaning. So I think that's a great place to end before Instagram cuts me off. Thank you everybody for showing up today and for waiting until I got the right lighting on this. And I'll be releasing more posts and videos in the next few days. So stay updated. Thank you so much.